Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I'll give you the first one from some of our neighbors to the west. How would you describe the rate Utica Shale possibilities in McKean County, Pennsylvania?
I think McKean and Potter County are going to march lockstep because both of them are north of that line that define the sharp contact versus the gradation contact. So the success or failure of those two wells that have been permitted in Potter County really are going to make a nice prediction for McKean County as well.
There's a professor at Cornell who says that fracking not only pollutes water supplies and the air, but also leaves the landscape an industrial wasteland. Can you say anything that might alleviate the concerns raised by these comments?
I've opened my comments even before the slides were going by saying this is an industry, and an industry does come with some risks. And it is true that some pads have been built where there were trees growing before. For example, in that is called industrialization, and it is true that there are large volumes of water that require very careful management, and it is true that there are going to be spills. These are the risks that we're talking about. Industry cannot completely eliminate these. They can work very hard at mitigating all of these. It is true also that air is an issue. Now, I started out this talk by pointing out that air quality is an issue largely because when we burn hydrocarbon fuels, the stuff we burn ends up in the atmosphere as CO2, and that's going to cause global warming. So that there is no two ways about it. That my colleague, his name is Tony Engelder, and Tony and I actually have co-authored a paper together, actually two papers. If you'd like to, I'd send you a copy of the Nature paper that we wrote together. Of course, we took different sides on the debate about fracking, and he says it's not worth the risk, and I say it is. Tony and I largely agree with one another, with maybe one exception, which is that Tony is one of these people that believes that we need to switch to renewables immediately and regardless of the cost. And I'm on the other side of things. You could call him then a neo-Malthusian. I, on the other hand, am an environmental optimist, which means that I recognize that in order to live the lifestyle we live, we're going to have to adapt a little bit. And that will require quite a bit of discipline going forward. But everything that he says there is a huge truth to it. Now, it can be spun, you know, as they say, there are lies, there are damned lies, and then there are statistics. And what he can do is he can use statistics and make things seem worse than they are. I can use statistics too and make things seem better than they are, and the truth is going to be somewhere in between the two of us. And we're pretty close. I have a great deal of respect for Tony and Graffia, and if that's the professor you're quoting. A couple of other guys are a little bit further out on the fringe.
What's his last name?
Ingraffia, Ingraffea. And actually, you can go online and look at a couple of the debates. And in this book I mentioned by Russell Gold. Russell Gold, in one of the chapters, actually talks about one of the debates that Tony and I had over in Sullivan County. I mean, this is a Wall Street energy reporter that writes about this.
How many parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere is too high to continue using fossil fuels as a primary fuel source?
That's not a fair question. What is there are different perspectives, and this requires an understanding of what life was like and what it will be like. First of all, prior to the Industrial Revolution, 288 parts per million was the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. There's a well-known environmentalist named Bill McKibben who claims that we can't let CO2 in the atmosphere go above 350 parts per million. Sadly, it's already passed through 400 parts per million. And projections are that if it goes to 500 parts per million, we'll have a 2 degrees centigrade, that's 4 degrees Fahrenheit, higher temperature that we're going to have to learn to live with. And what that will have implications, because as the National Geographic said, the cost of moving Miami was somewhere on the order of, I think it was 200 to 400 billion dollars is what it's going to cost us. And you notice also, incidentally, America in the past, of course, has been the largest hydrocarbon user. And America has, in terms of moving in case sea level comes up, at least if you read this National Geographic, America has 3 of the top 4 most expensive cities to move, one of which is New Orleans. And if you don't mind my saying so, I think it's just absolutely nuts right now to try to build or rebuild New Orleans, particularly those regions that are below sea level that are being rebuilt after Hurricane Katrina. And it's just that to me is political insanity. But, you know, who am I? I'm just a professor here at Penn State spouting off. Yeah, next question.
At one time, shale gas was described as a bridge fuel towards a renewable energy future. More recently, the term seems to have been retired. Has our rush towards the economic reward of shale gas caused us to lose our commitment to a renewable energy future?
One of the things that you want to do, you're aware of what TED Talks are. And if not, they're YouTube presentations on important topics. TED, capital T, capital E, capital D talks. And I gave one. What you want to do is Google my name and just TED and then TED Talk. And the title of my talk is The Fracking Debate. And what I'm best known for is providing some sort of independent, credible assessment of the amount of gas that might be recovered from the Marcellus. And I made this assessment in 2007. And there were 3 thoughts that occurred to me in 2007. One of which was, if I'm wrong, if you think Adelphia lost a lot of money here in Coudersport, Adelphia couldn't hold a candle to the amount of money I personally was going to cost America, if not the world, in terms of billions and billions of dollars invested. I mean, personally, that thought occurred to me. If I was wrong, if I was right, it was glaringly obvious that my being right would push off our trip, which has to happen towards renewables, and it would have and Grafia would say that my calculation in 2007 has had a devastating impact on the march towards renewables. And that's why he argues that this has to be done immediately. And I recognize that. So this was a lose-lose situation. And in this TED Talk, I described this. It's 12 minutes. I really recommend that you take a look at it. There's a third alternative, though. And that third alternative is that any system, and this includes the human economy, is heavily and critically dependent on energy and will thrive in proportion to the amount of energy that is available to it. And our economy, there's some very famous plots that plot GDP against energy expenditure, and it's a linear curve that goes all the way from the slums of Calcutta on up to where America is in terms of their GDP versus the amount of energy expended. Our economy is critically dependent on energy. And the reality is that because of gas shale, for example, anyone that heats their house with natural gas right now, over the last 5 winters, or 5 or 6 winters, because of the success of the industry, your gas bill, your natural gas bill for heating your house, you've saved hundreds of dollars each winter. You've saved thousands of dollars over that period of time. That's money that has gone into some other thing to help the economy out. So there are risks, there are upsides, there are downsides to all of this. And, you know, in the long run of history, I may well be crucified still for coming out and being one of the first independent proponents for the opportunities offered by natural gas. It may well be that my great-grandkids will judge me as the bad guy, the one guy that really delayed this march towards renewables. Now, I have offered that the term bridge fuel is just as relevant now as it always has been, because there is no country, starting with Germany and working down, that has been able to solve the unreliability of renewables problem. Natural gas can do that.
Does the subsidizing of scientific research by energy companies create an inherent conflict of interest when it comes to the results?
Oh, I love this. I get that question and another one, which is, are you paid by industry? And my reputation is that I am an industry shill, and it's very clear from my enthusiasm that I think industry is important. Now, having said that, let me say that anyone who has had no experience with the gas industry or the oil industry, that person cannot claim to be an expert on any of the things that we're talking about. I am who I am largely because, first of all, there is a demand for the students that I generate. And the students themselves go on and feed into this economy and this lifestyle that we know. In a sense, then, the mere fact that I am a geologist and that the governor pays my salary and allows me to educate geologists mean that industry is right in my hip pocket. Now notice it's not directly. By that route, that nickel does not come from industry, but it is enabled by the fact that you demand natural gas, you use natural gas, and that in order to feed this habit, if you like, then I have to produce students so that the habit can be fed. Now, let me point out that if you're against fracking, you're also against toilet paper, fertilizer, staying warm in the wintertime. And this list can just go on and on and on and on. The things that natural gas brings to our society are just so critical to your lifestyle. Now, let me say that in the future, it may well be that natural gas will be generated by bacteria that are cultured in very, very large ponds, so that natural gas from fracking eventually will not be the source of natural gas. But I will assure you that as long as there is a need for toilet paper, there will be a need for natural gas, which is the only way you can dry toilet paper effectively.
Should operators plug the unplugged wells in the vicinity of new drilling and fracking? If so, how far from the new drilling and fracking should the legacy wells be plugged?
All legacy wells should be plugged, regardless of how far they are from any fracking. The sad thing is that in the state of Pennsylvania, there are hundreds of thousands of old wells that are not even known right now. Equally sad was the fact that the demand for steel during the Second World War required that all old casing and cement jobs be literally pulled right out of the ground. And you know what happened with those wells? Someone sawed down a tree and jammed the top of the tree into the hole. And then those have been covered with soil and lost. And the DEP right now has an entire division that is devoted to finding and plugging old wells. And they're very difficult to detect. We're working on some geophysical techniques that will find these wells. I mean, talk about sheer stupidity. We allowed hundreds of thousands of gas wells, the location of those, to get away from us prior to the Second World War, and even through the Second World War. And it is the job of the state. Now, what happens, though, is that when we talk about paying for filling those wells, the DEP has a limited budget for doing that. And the sad thing is that it will come back on you, the gas users, to somehow or another provide the revenue that helps do that. All wells should be plugged.
Our hospital recently announced, at least for unconventional shale gas, What are your thoughts on the associated risk, and should they drill near the hospital? If so, should they have an evacuation plan?
The risk to a well-drilled, let's say in the Utica here in Potter County, a lateral that extends 2 miles from some pad 2 miles away underneath the hospital, the risk of that is just about zero. And no, there's no need for an evacuation plan from that distance. Now, having said that, though, I would certainly have a set of rules. Now, I served on the Governor's Marcellus Shale Advisory Commission, in which we revised the setbacks for all wells. And that's still in force. There are setbacks. I can't give you the numbers, but right now, what is the setback, Jackie? 500 feet. You know, and maybe that's even too small. I think in some other states those setbacks are larger, but the setback issue is largely a political one, and I admit that I served on a committee that talked a lot about how large the setback should be, and we debated, sat in a room, there were a number of us on the commission, we sort of went back and forth about the size of these setbacks and where they should be, what should be set back, and we also got into the issue of zoning regulations and who has what authority in terms of regulating all of this. And that's really a hot button issue. It is in New York State and it is in Pennsylvania. And the thinking that went into that was that industry has a very difficult time when dealing with, I don't know how many townships in Pennsylvania there are, but let's say several thousand townships, and each township has a slightly different set of regulations. Each industry would have to have a whole battery of lawyers going through the fine print, tooth and nail, with each township. And our rationale and reasoning was that it was unreasonable to have to sort through every little whim that was written into every little township zoning regulation. And so at some level, there should be some uniformity. Now, it may well be that the zoning rules, for example, for residential areas, for example, universally that should be off limits. And in fact there should be a setback for those. Now, that we're not talking about rural houses. Rural housing setback is different, and the rules on farmland, zone farmland, or zone just other ways are different. So this is political, and fortunately, I'm not the governor that has to deal with this sort of day-to-day business, and it is very real. And of course, as you know, in the state of Pennsylvania, Act 13, those parts of Act 13 were overturned by the Supreme Court, in which the local zoning trumped the state zoning regulations in Pennsylvania.
Why would the Utica, where the Point Pleasant is not present, not be drilled horizontally and fracked? Is that different from the Marcellus?
The Utica that I talk about, with that sharp contact, the most effective way of producing is with horizontal wells. In fact, is in New York State. That's what gave those very large wells. Early on, the wells were vertical, and a lot